It seems that the strategic value of Bakhmut isn't particularly high. So what's the value of Ukraine throwing more into this particular fight?
I think its psychological and political value seems to outweigh its strategic value. And in the minds of the people watching the conflict very closely, the notion of seeking to find a win in Bakhmut would put them in a stronger position with respect to their publics than it would as a stronger geopolitical position on the ground.
We know that Moscow has been trying to take this city for months now, but hasn't yet gained control. What does that tell us about Russia, about forces on the ground?
I think it shows us that there's still some significant disorganization in the Russian forces. That's been emphasized by the complaints of Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is, in effect, one of President Putin's favorites, his former cook, who runs this private military company, Wagner, and who has been collecting convicts out of Russian jails to supplement his regular fighters and throwing them into battle in the area around Bakhmut. They have failed to cut the last road, although apparently they're threatening that now. In the meantime, the Ukrainians have obviously also suffered significant losses, but are fighting very stubbornly in defense of the city, and street-to-street fighting, I think, has been going on for some time, and it seems to be more intense. But Prigozhin has suddenly found that he's running out of ammunition. He asked for it, he said, a week ago. He hasn't received what he hoped for, and is seemingly laying the groundwork that were he forced to withdraw from lack of ammunition, the Russian position would collapse, something quite different than we heard on Saturday, when it looked like Western military experts thought the Ukrainians were going to be pushed out by the Russian offensives. That's been a significant reversal, but it reflects the lack of cohesion in the Russian forces and Prigozhin's dependence on the Russian military's weak logistics to continue to keep his people in battle. And we'll have to wait and see. Each side will claim, obviously, a serious military victory, regardless of the judgment of experts as to whether this has geostrategic importance in the battles.
A senior Ukrainian commander has been quoted as describing the situation in the city as hell. It seems odd to ask specifically about street fighting when the entire situation feels as though it must be hell. But what can we take from the fact that this is the approach now being taken, that people are seeing intense street fighting as is being quoted?
It seems to reflect what we have been seeing for some time. The dedication, morale, commitment, and fighting capacities of the Ukrainians, supported obviously by arms supply from the West, outclasses what the Russians are able to put in the field, in part because the morale of the Russians seemingly is low. Their casualty rate is being reported as very high, and the uncertainties about cooperation among this private army group and the regular Russian military is clear, and the private army group is setting itself up for a situation in which if it's forced to retreat, it will certainly have predicted that in advance and somehow wish to escape the opprobrium that will attach to the failure on their part to carry the day against the Ukrainians. Is
there any sense that it would be, given the casualties, the best move to pursue a gradual withdrawal for President Zelensky here?
I think that President Zelensky has now gotten a correct intelligence picture from what's going on, and has decided that rather than to effect a withdrawal, preserving his forces, it's better for him to hang in with the defensive positions that he's now established, which the Russians have had an increasingly difficult time in moving against. But that's a calculated judgment, and obviously one clearly to be made by somebody on the spot with a full range of information, not for commentators at some remove who follow the battle. it's a judgment that one can see as having some significant impact, because the longer that President Zelensky and his military forces can hold off the Russians and defeat their capacity to expand their bridgeheads into Ukraine, the more likely he is to bring this particular process to some conclusion, probably around a negotiating table, probably taking a very long period of time, and probably after deeply dug-in resistance by President Putin. But a reversal of the Russian position around Bakhmut might start things moving slowly in that kind of direction.
Are you surprised by how little ground Russia is taking?
I was. I was quite convinced that they were going to invade, and it appeared as if they had sold themselves on a 3-day, 3-week, even 3-month victory. And their immediate moves against Kyiv as a way of starting a victorious battle to take over all of Ukraine seemed to be the right strategy. Their failure to do that and the remarkable but unexpected resistance put up by the Ukrainians was very important. We've gone all back over that. And the Ukrainians, of course, have been fighting the Russians in the east for 5 years or more, and learned a great deal and had a great deal of training, quiet training, by friends from the West, including the U.S., over that long period of what clearly was a quiet war against the Russians, but one in which they learned a great deal, particularly how to set up and prosecute an effective defense. But their offensive in the autumn to take back a lot of land also produced the kind of unexpected gains that people doubted would be theirs at the beginning of the battle, but now I think need to guard against the question of overconfidence that somehow the Ukrainians are going to take on the large Russian state with all of its economic, military, and personnel strength. That looks like a hard situation. I think that the best one can expect is maybe a stalemate inclining in their direction, which could produce an opening to some kind of negotiated end, which would take a very long time and depend heavily on the continuation of Ukraine being able to hold its ground and advance slowly against the Russians.
On that point, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has been speaking about the consequences if China were to send weapons to Russia for Moscow's war in Ukraine. What's your prediction for the direction, the approach China will now take?
It's very interesting because Scholz reported with some very significant confidence that China would not provide weapons to the Russians in the war against Ukraine. One can only believe that he's had some kind of inside conversations with the Chinese with respect to that. Otherwise, it would be a mistake, obviously, to make that kind of claim. Secondly, I think it's important for us to examine the deterioration, if I could put it this way, of what was clearly an unlimited Russia-China mutual commitment in the week prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the friendship without limits comments that both of them seemed to endorse at that time. As the Russians have had greater problems, it appears as if the Chinese have backed off from the kind of unlimited support that would take them into a position to provide significant military assistance to the Russians, probably in the form of things like ammunition and equipment and so on, to something a little more standoffish. And the Chinese presentation of an approach to a peaceful settlement, which the Russians have endorsed, but cannot be something, given its various strictures, that support more of what one would call a stalemate in place as opposed to a negotiated arrangement which would give the Russians an absolute victory at the end of the negotiations, is interesting because it shows Chinese skepticism about, put it this way, stressing their support for the Russians. China is still heavily dependent on Russian petroleum and gas, and China is still quite dependent on Russian military technology for its own development, even if the Ukraine is taking away any dependence on Russian military equipment at the present time. So China has clearly a more checkered future with Russia than I think a lot of people have given it credit for. And there's a lot of tendency, given what is going on in the United States, the demonization of enemies, and perhaps as a result of that demonization, an overstressing of their capabilities, rather than a more clear-eyed and truthful sense of the relative relationships between them, that the Chinese, certainly in my view, need to be part of a situation in which we seek to expand relations with them wherever we can. We can't do that on everything or very widely, but we need to begin to open up some channels of communication and some discussions to pull them further away from a creation of an ironclad bloc between Russia and China in opposition to both the U.S., NATO, and the European Union.